And yet, in the same centuries, more to the center of the Mediterranean, a nation was rising to power which would enact, if any would, the Middle Kingdom part of disciplined control. When the Greek second-century historian Polybius set himself to explain how the Greeks and Carthaginians had fallen into such debility, while Rome had conquered the world, not all his reasoned analysis of constitutions would serve. He had to invoke crescive morality, that where the Greeks were corrupt, the Romans of the time of Scipio, or of this portrait often called the elder Brutus, were at a peak of communal dedication. Yet what we read in the portrait is that the dedication is post-conscious. Rome, as successor state, has not begun at the primitive ground of the pre-individual. Greek awareness has been taken over with all its liabilities, but in the hardening grip of stoical self-rule. How desperately that grasp would be needed, would be put to the test, patrician portraits of the late Republic write, under the temptations of power and in the throes of civil war, make no doubt of. But the stress in which they are formed testifies not only to the trials and vices of empire, but to the fighting strength of Rome through moral crisis. If we have reached here a point of parallel with the Middle Kingdom left, it will teach us how radically, in the spiral of personality, the Roman, with its realistic and legal establishment of a responsible private citizen, is, from the brooding, still mask-like record of Egyptian consciousness in Sesostris III. Curious how the torment and force of the late Republic seems ironed out by the proclamation of Augustus, the smooth Virgilian statement of a golden age. Yet even through its most pious idealization, the sensuous and weighty consciousness makes an almost Napoleonic advance. Has our Middle Kingdom of Republican Rome become, with the Principate, a new kingdom? In what Pliny called the boundless majesty of the Roman peace, to which the German chieftain, the Romans make a desert and call it peace, Augustus' proclamation spread in public buildings, roads, and aqueducts, from Britain and Gaul to Africa and Asia. After the temples of Greece, engineering feats of a utilitarian civilization. Yet that whole outward empire, like the arched city itself, level upon level and vault opening under vault, encloses what Greece and Rome had ripened. The abyss of conscious personality, which, as the classical fall looms, becomes a demonic battleground, as if the world polarized had produced at one birth the Christian faith and the Nero of this Roman coin, climaxing the outward rule and inner crisis of the Julio-Claudian line. Though what Suetonius writes of Caligula caps Nero's bloodier angling in the lake of darkness. Finally seized with a mania for feeling the touch of money, he would often pour out huge piles of gold pieces in some open place, walk over them barefooted, and wallow in them for a long time with his whole body. And now, from all over the Hellenized empire, especially from Egypt and the East, here Alexandria, under the facade of order which so impressed Gibbon, the period in the history of the world during which the condition of the human race was most happy and prosperous, we catch the private citizen in the tenderness of lonely withdrawal, the old late kingdom syndrome of sensory repletion and supersensory desire, gazing from banqueting halls, peristyles, tombs, wide-eyed, beyond time and space.
Kaliotea sapamuzon prakathaget eterpnon, kai sapemus todotalatus gane deliapayan, humenes parestemon.
while from the 1st century on, little scenes testified to the coming in of mystery cults from the East. As Eliot says, when there is distress of nations and perplexity, whether on the shores of Asia or in the Edgware Road, Isis from Egypt, Mithras from Asia Minor, in that labyrinth a twine of immortality. By the 3rd century, imperial power, here Gallienus, is assuming the stylized mask of symbolic and superhuman sanction, the features hardening and thinning to an illusionistic surface through which the lost soulfulness and almost satanic search records its pain. And now, from the catacombs beneath that power vault, taking the earthly darkness as the medium of its life, comes the Christian transformation of temporal estrangement. The ruin and cave become a place of birth. Yet this art, like early chant or the meditations of Augustine, still wears the crepuscular softness and personality of the classical world. The direction of soul has changed, but body is not yet stripped. The wheel has not come full circle to the ground of radical force, though everywhere on the borders of the empire the cleansing savage bath waited for what Vico would first formulate, barbarian renewal by sanctified violence, the cyclical return of the pure and pious wars of the heroic peoples. Here, on the verge of the Christian West, let us note that the West also is a one among many, itself part of an evolving world context into which, in our day, it is fatefully reabsorbed. Strange that late classical luxury, such art as this Aphrodite Callipyge, Venus of the sweet Arse, from Nero's golden house, spread through the conquests of Alexander as far as the Ganges, would inspire an Indian culture of rejuvenated vitality and religious joy. This 8th century tree goddess from Madhya Pradesh, as if from the Greek source, two civilizations had diverged, both centered in the sacred, but one sanctifying the eros of nature and sex. The other repudiating body and world, time, space, and touch, or trying to, though it worshipped an incarnate Savior. In its Dark Age strength, this Gospel Book of Ebo, from Reims just after Charlemagne, dissolving all sensory forms into symbolic calligraphs, both arts of energy, both mystical, but the Western of ascetic denial, the Indian affirming the Godhead of flesh. Of these we turn to the more demonic release of the cyclical West. The West, which by the year 1000, paired by the folk wanderings of the Dark Ages to the abstract acerbities of spirit, this angular verdant Christ is again at the upswing of the wheel of individuation. As Vico says, we have observed the marvelous correspondence between the first and the returned barbarian times. And yet a Greek, almost geometric head from the start of classical culture against the Western attests again to the Hegelian transformation over 16 centuries. The clean and impersonal, the Homeric energy of the Greek is replaced in the Germanic. For all its reductive stylization and automatic surrender of person to faith, with the most intense and paradoxical core of mystical person, a selfless selfhood of God-bearing spirit. It is the reshaping of man himself. If 1000 was the Dark Age base of the cycle, in 200 years and all over Europe the great cathedrals, here Amiens, are looming up into the rain and fog, witnesses to the buttressing and incorporating theology of stone. From then until now, say 750 years, the Christian and post-Christian West has gone on. We mean to study it century by century in some detail. Here we pose three cyclical questions. Remembering the Greek, can we locate the western peak of man in his pride? When does the dialogue of mind with itself begin? And third, where are we now? Fauré thought to compare the Parthenon age in Greece with that of the cathedrals in France. But the mastery over stone, inherited from the classical, seems to have fruited early in the West. And what of personality? The saints of Reims, in their timeless stance, are far from the Phidian ripening, where individuation goes over into softening consciousness. 13th century literature, scholastic philosophy, the organer of the school of Perotin, those bare fifth chords sounding the mystery of faith, hint how structural, severe, and transhuman the cathedrals are. This force is sacred and hierarchical. Beside the Phidian touchstone, we sense it as barely resident in the articulations of space, time, and cause. At the start of the next century, Giotto speeds the recovery of space and human drama in painting. The glory of the art is beyond question, but the olive-eyed enigma, the haunting blend of smiling and grief, hint how far the moods and modalities still hang in the eternal frame. Another 100 years, Van Eyck, 1430, and the representational achievement is almost complete. Space and earthly things, jewels, robes, flesh. Yet the smiling Korai of the 6th century BC seem nearer than Phidias. Is not the charm of this art the tentative grace with which it accepts a medieval sanction rather than assert its own? So with Dunstable, or the Flemish musicians who follow him, equally unassuming, though as humanized in melody and chord. By the mid-15th century in Italy, Piero della Francesca, Partly through classical revival, partly through the growth of native awareness, we sense a first resonance with earlier peaks of emergence, individual ripening framed in the solemnities of common faith. We look back to the sure serenities of 4th Dynasty Egypt, searching through all that has changed, that purity against the cross